The church was grand, with tall, stained glass windows that cast colorful shadows across the pews. The mourners were dressed in elegant black attire, their hushed whispers echoing softly off the vaulted ceiling. It was the funeral of Richard Wainwright, a wealthy and well-known philanthropist who had passed away unexpectedly. The air was thick with grief and solemnity as his closest friends and family gathered to honor his memory. At the back of the church, an elderly black woman stood quietly by the door. Her clothes were modest but neat, a simple black dress and a pearl necklace that looked like they had seen better days. Her weathered hands clutched a small, faded photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as she gazed at the crowd. Despite her presence, no one approached her. In fact, most of the guests avoided making eye contact altogether. A few glanced her way, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disdain, as if silently questioning why she was even there. "She doesn't belong here," one woman whispered to her companion, her voice low but pointed. "Probably just wandered in off the street," the man replied, sneering. "Let the staff handle it." The woman remained silent, her eyes fixed on the casket at the front of the church. Her face held a mix of sadness and determination, as though she was carrying a burden no one else could see. She took a tentative step forward, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor, but the disapproving glares from the guests made her pause. She hesitated, unsure if she should proceed. As the service began, the officiant spoke of Richard's generosity and his unwavering commitment to helping others. "He was a man who gave so much to his community," the pastor said, his voice heavy with reverence. Richard Wainwright was a beacon of hope and kindness. The elderly woman lowered her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her grur IP on the photograph tightened as a tear rolled down her cheek. She muttered something under her breath, too quiet for anyone to hear. When the eulogy ended, the floor was opened for anyone who wished to share their memories of Richard. Several guests rose to speak, recounting stories of his charitable work and his dedication to his family. Each testimony painted him as a man of virtue, someone who had left an indelible mark on the world. Finally, the elderly woman took a deep breath and began to make her way down the aisle. Her movements were slow but deliberate, and the faint creak of her cane echoed in the silent room. The murmurs started almost immediately. "Who is she? What's she doing? She's going to embarrass herself." Undeterred, the woman reached the front of the church and turned to face the crowd. Her eyes swept over the sea of faces, many of which looked back at her with suspicion and judgment. She raised the photograph in her hand, her voice quivering but resolute. "I need to speak," she said. "There's something you all need to know about Richard Wainwright." The room fell silent, save for the occasional shuffle of a chair or a nervous cough. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were on her. For a moment she seemed to waver, as if reconsidering whether to speak at all. But then she straightened her shoulders and fixed her gaze on the audience. The words that followed left the room in stunned silence, and every face turned pale as the truth began to unravel. What she said next changed everything. The room was frozen in place, every mourner glued to their seat as the elderly woman's voice broke the silence. Her frail hands still clutched the photograph tightly, and tears streamed down her face, but her words were firm and steady. "I am Evelyn Carter," she began, her voice echoing in the large sanctuary. "And I knew Richard Wainwright long before any of you. You here could claim to—" Her statement drew confused murmurs from the crowd. A younger man near the back leaned toward his companion and whispered, "What's she talking about? She doesn't even look like she belongs here." Evelyn ignored the growing tension. Her gaze was unwavering as she looked across the room, daring someone to interrupt her. "He wasn't just a philanthropist or a community leader," she continued. "To me, Richard Wainwright was family." A sharp, collective gasp filled the air. "Family," How could that be possible? The guests exchanged glances, their disbelief evident. Richard Wainwright's family was as well documented as his charitable contributions, his beautiful wife, his 2 accomplished children, and generations of wealth stretching back decades. No one had ever heard of Evelyn Carter. I was his mother, Evelyn declared, her voice cracking but resolute. I gave birth to Richard, and I raised him when no one else would. For a moment, you could have heard a pin drop. Every face in the room was a portrait of shock and disbelief. Some guests looked openly skeptical, their eyes narrowing as they whispered among themselves. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure how to process what they were hearing. Evelyn paused, her eyes scanning the room. She saw the disbelief, the judgment, the doubt. She had expected it. She had lived with it her whole life. But she had also lived with a truth that no one could erase, and today she was determined to tell it. "You don't believe me, do you?" she asked, her voice soft but cutting. "Of course you don't. You see this old black woman and think, how could someone like her be connected to someone like him? But Richard was my son, and I will not let him be buried without the truth being known." Her words carried a weight that made even the most skeptical guests fall silent. She turned to the photograph in her hand and held it up for everyone to see. It was old and worn, the edges frayed from years of handling. In the photo, a young Richard Wainwright, no older than 5, sat on Evelyn's lap, his bright smile lighting up the frame. Beside them was a man, Evelyn's late husband, his arm wrapped protectively around them both. "This was taken when Richard was just a boy," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Back when he still called me Mama and told me I was his whole world." A ripple of emotion spread through the crowd. Some of the guests leaned forward, squinting at the photograph, as if searching for proof in the image. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Evelyn's grip on the cane tightened as she took a deep breath. "Richard was born in a small, segregated town in the South," she explained. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. I worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, and my husband, God rest his soul, did everything he could to make sure Richard had a better life than we did." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the memories flooding back. When Richard was a teenager, he decided he wanted to make something of himself. He said he was tired of being judged by the color of his skin. He worked hard, earned scholarships, and eventually went to college. That's where he met his future wife, Catherine. She came from a wealthy family, and they fell in love. Evelyn's face darkened, the weight of painful memories clouding her expression. But when Catherine's family found out about me, everything changed. They didn't want their daughter associated with someone like me. They told Richard he had to choose his family or his future. Her voice broke, and she paused to wipe away a tear. "He chose his future," she said quietly. "He married Catherine and left me behind. He changed his name, cut off all contact, and built a new life for himself. A life where I didn't exist." The crowd was spellbound, their earlier skepticism melting away. Even those who had judged Evelyn the harshest now looked at her with a mixture of pity and guilt. "I didn't come here today to cause a scene," Evelyn continued. "I came because, no matter what happened between us, Richard was my son. I loved him, and I forgave him a long time ago. But I won't stand here and let you bury him without acknowledging the truth of who he was and where he came from." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Evelyn's words hanging in the air. For the first time, the mourners saw her not as an intruder, but as a mother grieving the loss of her child. As Evelyn turned to leave, her cane tapping softly against the floor, a voice called out from the front row. "Wait," said a young woman, her face pale and tear-streaked. It was Richard's daughter, Emily. Evelyn stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned slowly to face the girl, her eyes wide with surprise. Emily rose to her feet, clutching a tissue in her hand. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you really my grandmother?" Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room held its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. What would happen next was anyone's guess. Evelyn's lips quivered as she stared at Emily, Richard's daughter. The words she had longed to say for decades caught in her throat. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of the moment. The sanctuary was deathly silent, all eyes locked on the two women, one standing, trembling with uncertainty, the other leaning heavily on a cane, carrying the burden of years of grief and longing. "Yes," Evelyn finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm your grandmother." Emily gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stumbled back a step, her legs barely supporting her. Why didn't I know about you?" she stammered. "Why didn't he tell us?" Evelyn took a shaky step forward, her cane tapping against the polished floor. "Because Richard wanted to protect you," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "He wanted to give you a life free from the pain and judgment he grew up with. He thought that cutting ties with me was the only way to do that." Emily's face crumpled, her tears flowing freely now. "That's not fair," she choked out. "He didn't even give us a chance to know you." Evelyn's heart ached as she saw the pain in her granddaughter's eyes. "I know," she said softly, "but he thought he was doing what was best for you. He loved you and your mother more than anything." The rest of the guests sat frozen, watching the emotional exchange with a mix of awe and guilt. The once dismissive faces of the wealthy mourners now held expressions of shame and regret. Whispers spread through the crowd, but no one dared to interrupt. Emily took a hesitant step toward Evelyn. "All this time," she began, her voice trembling. "All this time, I thought my family history was perfect. I thought we came from nothing but privilege and success." But now she looked up at Evelyn, her eyes searching. "Now I realize I never even knew where I came from." Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against Emily's. "You come from strength," she said firmly, "from resilience, from love. Your father may have made mistakes, but everything he did out of love for you." A heavy sob escaped Emily's lips, and she threw her arms around Evelyn. The elderly woman stiffened in surprise, her cane nearly slipping from her grasp, but then she melted into the embrace, her arms wrapping tightly around her granddaughter. The room erupted into murmurs of astonishment, and several guests wiped tears from their own eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Decades of pain and separation dissolved in that single embrace, leaving only love and a longing to heal. Evelyn held Emily close, her own ears falling freely now. "You remind me of him," she whispered. "When he was your age, he had that same fire in his eyes." Emily pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice steady despite her emotions. "About you, about him, about where we come from." Evelyn smiled, a bittersweet expression that spoke of both joy and sorrow. "He'll tell you," she promised. "But there's something I need to do first." The room watched in stunned silence as Evelyn turned back toward the casket. Her cane tapped rhythmically against the floor as she approached, her steps slow but purposeful. She stopped at the edge of the dais, staring down at the polished wood that separated her from the son she had lost so long ago. She placed her hand on the casket, her fingers trembling. "Richard," she said softly, her voice breaking, "I forgive you. I always have. I just hope you found peace." The raw emotion in her voice brought the room to tears. Even the most hardened skeptics found themselves wiping their eyes, unable to deny the depth of her pain and love. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the casket as if she could reach through the wood and touch her son one last time. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me," said a man's voice, firm but hesitant. Evelyn turned to see one of Richard's closest friends, a man named Charles, standing in the front row. His face was pale, and his hands fidgeted nervously. I didn't know," Charles said, his voice trembling. "Richard never told me about you. But now I can't help but wonder why. Why didn't he let us help him? Why didn't he trust us to understand?" Evelyn looked at Charles, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and wisdom. "Because he knew the world we live in," she said simply. "He knew how people would look at me, at him, at our family. He thought he was sparing you the pain of judgment and prejudice. But in doing so, he carried that burden alone." Charles nodded, his should air slumping as the weight of Evelyn's words sank in. The room was silent once more, the gravity of the moment settling over everyone. And then, from the back of the room, another voice called out. "She's right," said an elderly woman, her voice steady despite her age. "We judged her the moment she walked in here. We didn't even give her a chance. And now, we're the ones who have to live with that." The admission sent a ripple through the crowd. Heads nodded in agreement, and murmurs of regret filled the room. For the first time, the guests began to see Evelyn not as an intruder, but as a mother who had endured unimaginable pain and loss. Evelyn turned back to the crowd, her eyes scanning the room. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said softly. "Richard believed in second chances. Let's honor him by giving each other the same." As she spoke, a sense of hope began to fill the air. The guests, once cold and dismissive, now looked at Evelyn with respect and admiration. A sense of unity began to form, the barriers of prejudice and judgment slowly breaking down. But just as the atmosphere began to shift, the doors to the sanctuary burst open. A man in a crisp black suit strode in, his face pale and his expression urgent. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Evelyn and Emily. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice tense. "But there's something you need to see." The room fell into stunned silence, everyone's attention now focused on the man at the door. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as she exchanged a worried glance with Emily. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between the guests. "It's about Richard," he said finally. "There's something we just found out." The tension in the room was palpable, every face filled with apprehension. Evelyn tightened her grip on her cane, her heart pounding in her chest. What is it?" she repeated, her voice firmer this time. The man took a deep breath, his expression grim. "It changes everything." Evelyn's heart raced as she gripped the cane tighter. The man's words, "It changes everything," echoed in her mind. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with anticipation. Emily stepped closer to her grandmother, her face pale with worry. "Please," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Just tell us." The man hesitated, glancing at the crowd that hung on his every word. "Can we speak privately?" he asked, his voice low. "No," Evelyn said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her tone. "Whatever it is, say it here. Everyone deserves to know." The man sighed and nodded. "All right. Earlier today, we received some documents from Richard's lawyer," he began, addressing the room. "They contained instructions to be opened after his passing. Among them were files that prove he was conducting an investigation, a personal investigation into the truth about his own life." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Evelyn frowned, confusion furrowing her brow. "What kind of investigation?" she asked, her voice laced with apprehension. The man's face was grim. He was looking into the circumstances of his birth, specifically, who his father really was. The air seemed to leave the room in an instant. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled, and she leaned heavily on her cane for support. Emily grabbed her arm, steadying her. What are you saying?" Evelyn stammered. The man stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richard discovered that his father wasn't the man you told him about. It wasn't your husband, Evelyn." Evelyn's eyes widened in shock. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "There's no way. I'm afraid it's true," the man said gently. Richard uncovered evidence that his biological father was someone else entirely, someone connected to a part of his life he never shared with anyone. The room buzzed with speculation, the whispers growing louder. Evelyn's mind reeled as she tried to process the revelation. "Who?" she finally managed to ask, her voice breaking. "Who was his father?" The man hesitated, his gaze heavy with regret. "A man named Victor Grant," he said. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The name was like a thunderclap, reverberating through her very soul. Victor Grant, the man who had been her boss decades ago, the man who had made her life a living nightmare. Emily looked between Evelyn and the man, her brow furrowed. "Who is Victor Grant?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "Grandma, what's going on?" Evelyn closed her eyes, memories she had long buried rising to the surface. She could see Victor's face as clearly as if he were standing in front of her. His cold, calculating smile. His eyes, always watching, always judging. He was a monster, Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was my employer, and he was obsessed with me." Emily's jaw dropped. "What do you mean, obsessed?" Evelyn took a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "I worked for him when I was young. He was powerful, wealthy, and used to getting what he wanted. He pursued me relentlessly, even though I was married. When I rejected him, he made my life unbearable." The room was utterly still, the guests hanging on Evelyn's every word. Tears streamed down her face as she continued. "I thought I had escaped him. I thought I was free. But if what you're saying is true, if Victor Grant was Richard's father—" Her voice broke, and she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. Emily's face twisted with a mix of anger and confusion. "So, you're saying my dad's real father was this horrible man?" she asked, her voice rising. "Why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he tell you?" Evelyn shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "He must-a. He found out too late," she said, her voice trembling. "He must have been trying to protect you." The man cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. "There's more," he said, his voice heavy. "Victor Grant passed away years ago, but his estate has been tied up in legal battles ever since. Richard was in the process of claiming what was rightfully his." Evelyn's breath hitched. "Claiming what?" she asked. The man hesitated, then said, "A massive inheritance." Richard uncovered proof that Victor Grant left behind a fortune, and that he named Richard as his sole heir. Gasps filled the room. The wealthy guests who had been so dismissive of Evelyn now exchanged wide-eyed looks of shock and intrigue. Evelyn shook her head, disbelief etched on her face. "I don't care about his money," she said firmly. "All I care about is the truth. Why didn't Richard come to me with this? Why didn't he tell me what he'd found?" The man's expression softened. "I think he was trying to spare you," he said gently. "He didn't want to dredge up painful memories. He wanted to protect you, just as you wanted to protect him." Evelyn's heart ached as she thought of her son, the secrets he had carried, the sacrifices he had made. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Oh, Richard, what have you done?" Emily stepped forward, her face set with determination. "We need to know the whole story," she said. "Grandma, this isn't just about the past. This is about who we are, who he was." Evelyn nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right," she said. "We need answers, but we're not going to get them sitting here." The room erupted into whispers as Evelyn and Emily turned to leave. The guests, who had spent the day judging and dismissing Evelyn, now watched her with a mixture of awe and respect. As they reached the door, Evelyn turned back to face the crowd. "Richard believed in doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Let's honor his memory by doing the same." With that, she and Emily stepped out of the sanctuary, leaving behind a room full of people whose lives had been forever changed. But the answers they sought were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And as Evelyn and Emily set out on their journey, they knew that the truth would change everything. Evelyn and Emily sat in silence as their car navigated the winding streets toward the address listed in Richard's files. The man from the funeral had handed them a sealed envelope before they left, his eyes heavy with sympathy. Inside was a note scrawled in Richard's unmistakable handwriting and a set of directions that led to a small law firm in the next town. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her jaw clenched as she processed the day's revelations. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, the note clutched in her trembling hands. The words Richard had written echoed in her mind. "Mom, if you're reading this, then I didn't get to tell you myself. I'm sorry. But there's more to our story than either of us ever knew. This firm has everything you need to understand. And please, no matter how hard it is, don't let it destroy you. You taught me to be brave. Be brave now." Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks as she read the note again, her heart breaking at the thought of her son carrying such a heavy burden alone. Emily glanced at her grandmother, her eyes softening. "We're going to get through this," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Whatever's waiting for us, we'll face it together." Evelyn nodded, drawing strength from her granddaughter's resolve. "He was always so brave," she whispered. "Even as a little boy, I wish I could have been there for him when he needed me." Emily reached over and squeezed her grandmother's hand. "He knew you loved him," she said. "That's why he did all of this, to protect you." As they approached the law firm, a sense of foreboding settled over them. The building was modest, its brick facade worn but tidy. They stepped inside, the air cool and quiet, and were greeted by a middle-aged receptionist with kind eyes. "You must be Evelyn and Emily," she said, standing to shake their hands. "My name is Grace. Richard told me to expect you." Evelyn's breath caught. "You knew my son?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grace nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "He was a good man, determined, kind. He came to us a few months ago, asking for help to uncover the truth about his father. He wanted to make sure you and Emily were taken care of, no matter what." Emily frowned. "Why didn't he tell us?" she asked. "Why go through all of this alone?" Grace hesitated, then gestured for them to follow her. "He didn't want to burden you," she said, "but now it's time for you to know everything." They followed Grace down a narrow hallway to a conference room, where a stack of documents waited on the table. Grace handed Evelyn a folder marked Victor Grant Estate. "This is everything Richard uncovered," she said. "It's a lot to take in, but it's all here." Evelyn opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the pages. There were birth certificates, letters, and legal documents that painted a shocking picture. Victor Grant had been a powerful man, but also a deeply flawed one. He had fathered several children out of wedlock, using his wealth and influence to silence the women involved. But Richard had been different. He had fought to uncover the truth and claim his rightful inheritance, not out of greed, but to ensure that his mother and daughter would be provided for. Evelyn's heart ached as she read the letters Richard had written, but never sent. In one, he detailed his anger and heartbreak at learning the truth about his father. In another, he expressed his hope that his efforts would bring closure to his family. Emily's voice broke through Evelyn's thoughts. "Grandma, look at this," she said, holding up a document. It was a deed to a property, a sprawling estate that had once belonged to Victor Grant. Richard had fought to have it transferred to Evelyn's name. Evelyn stared at the paper in disbelief. "He did all of this for us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Even when he was carrying so much pain, he was thinking of us." Grace placed a comforting hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "He loved you both more than anything," she said, "and he wanted you to know that you're stronger than any of the secrets or struggles that came before." Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We'll honor him," she said. "We'll make sure his sacrifices weren't in vain." As they left the law firm, the weight of the truth settled over them. Evelyn and Emily knew that their journey wasn't over, but they also knew that they were stronger together. Richard's legacy would live on in their love, their courage, and their determination to rise above the shadows of the past. The story of Evelyn, Emily, and Richard had been one of heartbreak, resilience, and ultimately, hope. And as they drove away from the law firm, the sun breaking through the clouds, they knew that their future was bright because they had each other. If you found this story moving, don't forget to like, share, and follow for more heartfelt tales like this one.